Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, where today we are learning how to use that little movie button on your camera to start telling some stories with video. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, a weekly podcast for those who believe that moments matter most and that a beautiful photo is more than just a sum of its settings. A show for those who want to do more with the gear they have to take better photos today. And now, your host, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back to this week's episode of the podcast. I have something a little bit different for you today, but it is a topic that I know that many of you, my photo friends, are interested in, if not curious about, and that is video. Today, I chat with Mike Wilhelm, who is the co-host of the Videomaker podcast, along with Chris. And together, they talk all about video and all of your video needs, of course. Now, a few months ago, I actually had the opportunity to sit down with them on their podcast, virtually, of course, and talk about my intro into film and then how I transitioned into photography. But there are a ton of great tips for new photographers like you on things like, what camera to buy, and then great tips on composition, lighting, things like that. So even though it's the Video Maker podcast, I highly suggest that you still go check it out. And I posted the link in the show notes as well. It is a perfect companion interview for this one that you're going to hear today. In fact, I just listened to my interview with Mike and Chris yesterday, and while I kept asking myself, oh my God, is that really how I sound? I also thought, how can I answer more of your photography questions? So this Friday, and if you're listening to this in the future, we're going to be doing these monthly. I am hosting a live Q&A in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. So if you have any questions about photography, I'd love to answer them live this Friday. And I'll post the exact time in the group when you join so that you can, be sure to join us. And if you're not already a part of the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group, then just simply search Facebook for Beginner Photography Podcast and the group will pop up. Me and all of your new photo friends would be happy to have you in the group. Okay, so with that, let's get chatting today with Mike Wilhelm. That sounded weird. Mike, with you getting started in video production with like TV and commercials, kind of like myself, one thing that I always found really interesting was just the power of telling a story, right? When we first get started, we get really excited when we're on our own to kind of do all the technical things ourselves, but then we really learn quickly the power of telling a story in what it is that we're producing. So for you, how would you start introducing story into some of your earliest video projects?
I would say that my very earliest video projects were like 100% story. Like a lot of people, I got started, making videos in junior high school and high school, doing monkeying around with my dad's old VHS-C camcorder. And, at the time we were just like goofing around, doing silly stuff like pointing our camera at ourselves and then plugging into the TV and doing like the world's effect and all that.
Yeah.
But eventually, going into high school, we had assignments like creative writing assignments, or actually one that I recall specifically was like it was like a dramatic presentation where you had to like act out, some Greek play or something, right, from English class. And I was never a big performer, but I did like cameras, so I talked my teacher into letting me shoot a movie of this little scene rather than acting it out in front of the class. And so story for me was like right from the start. That's what video was for, was to put images together and tell some sort of story. As kids, I think, we enjoy the process of like imagination, obviously, and acting it out in play, but also, in like creative writing, you tell stories. And, I think I must have written my first story in fourth grade or something. You write like a page story or something. That's fun and all, but then actually using a camera and turning it into imagery makes it just sort of come to life in a way that is really magical. So, for me, getting started, that's what it was all about, is just to tell a story and communicate it. I wasn't the greatest writer. I wasn't the most charismatic person or performer, but I could tell stories with images. And so that's what it was all about. And I believe truly that video and photography is really all about stories. No matter what kind of kind of work you're doing. You know, I spent years making commercials, and I considered every single commercial, no matter how like cheesy or, you know, pretty straightforward it was, to be a story of some kind. If you're communicating any kind of message, you can apply the same elements of storytelling in it throughout. You know, we're talking about the classic 3-act structure. You're going to put it to everything, anything that has any kind of timing. I don't know if 3-act structure works for photography or not, but certainly.
Well, it can if you have a you know, like a long-term project or just a
Oh yeah, there you
series
go.
of photos.
Series,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So for me, it was right from the beginning.
It's funny how similar our stories are. You know, last week you and I chatted on the Videomaker podcast, and I shared my story. And it was the same. You know, when you got into high school, you're like, wait, I don't have to write something. Like, I can make a video. Like, this is fantastic. Definitely going to do this.
You know, I think at our age, what happens is, you know, shooting movies at home is actually kind of a novelty. Now it's commonplace, but at the time it was like, wow, you can do this. You absolutely should, you know, make a movie instead of writing this 3-page story or paper or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, my son he's 8, and he has an old iPhone 6S, right? And it still shoots 4K video. It has iMovie like built into it. And he was just messing around one day and was just playing around with, you know, some of the effects and throwing in some clips and stuff. And I remember just that moment when he showed me what it was that he created, and it was just simple cuts and things like that. And I remember all of the hours that I spent, you know, taking and ingesting those mini DV tapes that you had to do in real time for it to copy. And it was the old like G4 IMAX at the local college, because I had nothing to edit on. And now, as you said, it's commonplace. Like, we can do this kind of anywhere we want to. But I feel like I'd love to hear your thoughts on giving everybody the tool to be able to tell a story, because, you know, we gave everybody a pen and paper, and now everybody can, in theory, you know, write something out. They can write a story. They can tell a story. Before, only a select few had cameras, video cameras, but now everybody has them. Do you think that the overall, maybe not the production, but the overall point of filmmaking and storytelling has gotten better or worse over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so?
Oh, way better. Absolutely way better. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You know, we talk about it all the time on the Videomaker podcast, that it really doesn't matter what kind of camera you have. If it can record images and sound, it's good enough. You can do amazing things with almost nothing. And, you know, a little anecdote we talk about, I mention all the time, people are probably annoyed about it by now, but, you know, Stanley Kubrick was once asked about, like, what is the best aspect ratio you like to shoot on, you know, for your films? And he says, it's just a canvas, you know, it's just a place to do art. So whatever the requirement is, I'll make art for that medium. You can go back in history and look at some of the greatest photographs of all time. You know, Ansel Adams wasn't shooting on, you know, a 5D Mark IV or anything like that, you know?
Right.
So the equipment it makes no difference in my mind in terms of creating art. As for, you know, everyone having access to it, I mean, I think you can look at YouTube and the internet as a whole as an example of what happens when everyone has access to these creative tools. Like, incredible things happen, and people are introduced to the art of storytelling that never would have before, because it was too far out of reach. You know, just buying your first camera could be difficult. In fact, I can remember my first video camera. I don't think I bought it until, I was in college. Everything before that was just whatever I could get my hands on. You know, my dad would rent a camera. I would use that. Now everyone has it. So they're developing their skills early, and they're exercising those creative muscles all the time. And obviously that's going to have a big impact on the creative world. You know, I was just talking to a friend yesterday about Tiger Woods, right? I don't know if you're into golf at all, but, you know, Tiger Woods, he played, and then they had to like lengthen all the courses because he was so good. They had to like make them longer.
I didn't know that.
and you know, it's one of those things where this was a guy who started playing golf as a young child, and he was working at it for years and years and years. And now we have people who are coming up in that world who have also been playing since a child, and the level of play is like climbing, right? So I think you could say the same thing about the creative world. You know, when you have an entire generation of kids that have cameras in their hands by like the age 2, my niece has a camera. She's 2 years old. Then the level of work is just going to go up and up and up. And maybe bad news for you and I, who we didn't get started until later. But yeah, it's only a good thing, I think, for the progression of the art.
Well, in a world where we have obviously, amazing like world class shorts that are filmed by people, on an iPhone, these little documentaries that are critically acclaimed. Obviously, when it comes to documentaries, the story is kind of everything, and the imagery is almost secondary. But we also live in a world where we have just TikTok and Instagram, and I feel like the two sides are being polarized, right? Like the good is getting great, and the okay is getting terrible when it comes to telling stories and whatnot. And some people may not like that I said that, but oh well. I would love to hear your thoughts, kind of going on that Tiger Woods example here. Do you think that we're taking storytelling and cinematography to a place that it's never seen before, and that like we're just pushing the envelope so far forward? Or do you think that that's all just extra when it comes to making video?
I could just sort of describe this phenomenon as just an expansion of competition, right? Like maybe the mediocre art is now pretty bad, but that's really just by comparison. It's like a numbers game, right? If the number of films that are created each year is expanding exponentially, then the world only has so much attention to focus on things, and so they're going to focus their attention on whatever the top 10% of work is, essentially, right? Meanwhile, the entire spectrum is expanding, so more people are getting into it. And, more people are maybe having a hard time breaking through. I'll call it the noise, but it's not really noise, but breaking through the crowd, I guess, to try to reach that top 10%. It's becoming more and more and more difficult to do that. It's certainly easier to enter the arena, to enter the sort of competitive space, to try to make your voice heard, to make your story heard when you're making TikToks. We can all do that like before the end of this podcast. But in terms of who's breaking through and what's standing out, the bar is raising all the time, just because there's so many more people participating. And if you do mediocre work, it's just harder and harder and harder to get through. Like if you ever watch TV from the 80s, anyone who does that, right, you watch it and go, wow, this is pretty bad.
Pretty bad, yeah.
As opposed to today, we're like living in this golden age of television, despite actually the kind of decline of broadcast TV. Just because there's just so much talent out there that the mediocre stuff has just a less of a chance to rise up to the top.
So in your words, what do you think it is that would take you to that level? As you said, it's very easy to get into the arena. Essentially, we can all buy a camera. We all have cameras. What would take us from mediocre to creating really good work?
Boy, if I knew that, maybe I would be doing something else, making Netflix films or something, right? But I think if I were to describe it, it would be, you've got to know the fundamentals of storytelling. And, like I mentioned, the 3X structure and Freytag's pyramid is like ultra important. If you just sort of abandon these core concepts of storytelling, then it's going to be hard to get anywhere. That being said, today, with competition as stiff as it is, then I think it comes down to really having new creative ideas. If you can show someone something they've never seen before, while using the fundamentals of storytelling to make sure that people's attention is, totally captured, I think that's what's going to do it. If you look at some of the big hits on, all the streaming services, there are stories that are just absolutely unique. I think you could look at maybe Game of Thrones as a good example of this. I don't know of any story that has been serialized in such a way where it's like this part fantasy, part soap opera, super violent, super sexual. It was just like this new thing. People saw this story, and it was unlike anything that they'd ever seen. And I think it's that element that really takes something to the next level, on top of fantastic photography, on top of fantastic writing. You can have fantastic writing, but if the editing is poor, the pacing is poor, you're you're going to have a hard time. So you got to nail the fundamentals and also have just incredibly original and captivating ideas.
So when it comes to incredibly, original and captivating ideas, when my wife and I first got together, she had watched Mulholland Drive, right? And that's one of those movies that, it leaves you kind of wondering, what did I just watch, right? But at the same time, I would consider that pretty original and a captivating idea. So for these directors like, David Fincher, where do you think the separation is between something like a Game of Thrones, where they're pushing the envelope, and any David Fincher movie, as far as how far different they are? Does that question make sense?
Boy, I mean, the question of what's the difference between these two things.
We could go on forever.
Some filmmakers just have this amazing ability to take kind of a basic story and turn it into just this absolutely captivating work. I wish I could put my finger on what it is. Certainly there are some films that can thrive and succeed and just knock it out of the park based on the writing and the characters. And David Fincher may fall into that category. The movie that I always point at as a good example of this for me has always been Napoleon Dynamite, where I don't know, the story is kind of like there's nothing there. Like we've heard this story 100 times, right?
Yeah.
Underdog, achieves the thing that he was unexpected to achieve. But the characters were so interesting and compelling that you couldn't help but turn away. And at the same time, David Fincher has this ability to just tell this story, and his timing is such that, it kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat throughout. Even though you may have kind of followed this story before, you kind of know where it's going. It somehow holds your attention. They just have this ability to execute these ideas superbly well. And this is one of those cases where if I knew the formula to that, then I'd be doing what he's doing.
Well, then let's talk about what you do know, right? What are your thoughts on just, for brand new photographers to be able to tell a better story within an image? Because, and I think I've heard you say this before, when it comes to video, we have motion, we can move around, we can explore the scene, but in a photo, we have one frame and the story needs to fit within that frame. So what sorts of elements would be required to tell a good story within a single frame of film?
So I think that, first and foremost, if you're looking at a single frame, you got to have the fundamentals down, right? Like you have to have the composition, the fundamentals of composition figured out. It has to be, well lit, and all of that sort of basic stuff. You have to get down so you don't have to think about it when you're actually trying to capture images. But beyond that, I would say that I'm a big believer in editing. And when I say editing, I don't necessarily mean like cutting things up in timeline in your video editing software, or touching up the color in Lightroom or anything. That is editing, surely, but editing is just about making creative decisions in the process of creating and removing pieces that don't need to be there, right? I think that a strong image that tells a story, especially if it's a photograph that needs to tell a story all on its own, really has to have all the important pieces in place to sort of portray what's going on and not much else. The more pieces of noise there are, and I say noise in the sense that, maybe there's like a lot of noise in this shot, with my computer here. Well, actually the computer tells a little bit of a story, but maybe this coffee cup shouldn't be here, right? The more pieces of noise there are, the more things that will capture people's attention, the harder time they'll have to figure out like what's actually going on and what's important. So, I'm all about making sure that the elements of an image all contribute to telling the story in some way. Otherwise, I think things get muddy.
Mm-hmm.
With video, certainly you have a number of other elements, dialogue and sound and time. But in terms of like an individual image, I think that's it. I think it's placing things that need to be in the shot, so that they can tell a story about what is actually happening here and cut the rest.
Oh, I love that. Let's talk for a second about that idea of having a photo project, because I think that that's going to be most closely related to working in video and, once again, telling stories, right? So when we have a video project, or I'm sorry, when we have some sort of photo essay, photo project, what do you think would be, I'm sorry, this is a bad question here. Let's say that you're being approached for a commercial shoot, right? Let me ask, the commercial is meant to display a product or a business, right? That's all that it is. But simply having a sign that says, come down to Joe's is very boring, right? So we have to create images that want to get people to come down to Joe's. Where do you start in creating a story to be able to capture?
I mean, if you're talking about a commercial, it really comes down to, you got to figure out what is the thing that you're trying to convince the viewer of.
Mm-hmm.
So, usually it's not like, buy this thing, buy this coffee mug. It's that you have to convince someone, in this case of this coffee mug, what is special about it. Like, this coffee mug will keep your coffee at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 7 hours or whatever, right? It's like, so you got to have a convincing story here, because just coming out and saying, buy this coffee mug is just not going to cut it, right? It's all about persuasion. And there was a great TED talk. I wish I could recall the person who gave it. But the general idea is, why, how, what, with the idea that as you're delivering a message, you start with the why. Why is something important? Then how do you achieve that thing? And then what is it that you're trying to achieve? So this is the Apple philosophy of marketing, where they start with their vision, they get into the process, and then they reveal the product at the end, right? And the whole idea is you're trying to convince the viewer the thing that you're trying to convince them of, that they cannot live their life without this device, because of like some philosophical idea that people at Apple have, right? So it's really just about what is the best way to persuade someone of a general idea, that ultimately, in the case of commercials, will lead them to buying a product or service.
Well, what about, let's tone that down. Obviously, that was very. You come from the world of sales, right? Of essentially commercials. You're trying to sell something. You're trying to pitch something. Let's say that something that very often happens to new photographers is that maybe they got the new camera, they're going out to the zoo with their kids, right? We can all capture 1 billion photos of that, but what photos do you think are gonna tell the overall story of going to the zoo? What do we need?
When I would say that, when you go to the zoo and you're thinking about the photos that you're going to take, you might think about, oh, I'm just going to get a great shot of an elephant or a lion or something. But the story of going to the zoo, the actual, visiting the zoo is done by people, and it is their experience at the zoo, right? So in those cases, I would say, if you're telling that story, you have to sort of try to find a way to combine these different elements of the people, like maybe it's your family, I guess, right? The animals themselves, and then you got to try to capture some sort of emotion that I don't want to say necessarily accurately portrays what's actually happening. We talked about on a Videomaker podcast about this idea that I like the fantasy of visual storytelling, but something that captures the emotion that you want to feel when you look at the photo again later. So I would look for opportunities in those cases to capture emotions of the family with some sort of zoo-like element, probably some sort of animal, but it could be a sign or it could be a zoo worker. I would look for those moments. Don't spend so much time focusing on just like getting great shots of, birds or, whatever it is. Those are going to be cool. You go back and you might be impressed with your technical ability to capture animals, which is fine if that's what you're going for. If you want to be a wildlife photographer and using this as like practice, then that's great as well. But if you're trying to identify what that story is beforehand, and you have identified it in something like the family's trip to the zoo, you absolutely have to find a way to blend these elements together of people, zoo elements, which I guess is animals, and some sort of emotion, which is going to probably come through in the eyes and facial structure, facial expressions.
I always love looking at people's pictures from the zoo, because it's always like super long lens, trying to just frame the animal as if like they're really on the Serengeti or something like that. But we all know you're like, we're in Cleveland. Like, you know, that's
Yes.
not Africa there. Yeah.
You know,
Um,
it's a good example, I think, because you know, as a video person, I was never that into photography until video technology sort of, you know, pushed everyone to using DSLRs. In which case, it's like, okay, now my video camera shoots photos, and I started to take up photography. And one of the first things I did was I went to the zoo. I had a
I knew it. See, such a good
yeah,
example.
and same thing happened. I think I took 1,200 photos of animals in pens. And guess how many times I've looked at those pictures since that day? Even though they were
Zero.
pretty, yeah,
Yeah.
none. Never looked at
But I bet if there was, say, a kid in the foreground looking over the fence, trying to see a giraffe, suddenly that's a photo that maybe
it.
you would
Yeah.
want to look at later.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So what about, as you just mentioned there, you know, the blending of cameras essentially. We used to have a camera and we used to have a video camera. These were two separate things. And then the cell phone came along. And, oh no, wait, actually I take that back. I don't even remember what it was called. It was like a Sanyo. This thing was crazy. It was ridiculous. It was like a little tiny pocket camera and you flip it open and you could switch from video mode to photo mode. And I remember seeing this thing and I bought it for that exact reason. I was like, wherever I go, I now no longer have to take stills from my 480p video to have a photo of this, and being able to have both was very exciting. So let's say that there's plenty of new photographers right now listening, and they got into photography because they love the idea of capturing moments. Right? Should we be exploring the video functions of our cameras? And if so, do you have any good beginner tips to just getting started with that? Like, what should we do with some of this footage, maybe?
Well, I think it's worth anyone who is learning photography to switch over to video mode and take a few clips now and again. And I think what you're going to find is that a lot of the fundamentals translate over pretty seamlessly. Camera movement can be difficult, which is a new skill to learn, and audio capture is a new skill to learn. But if you already have the camera that can do it, yeah, you absolutely should experiment with it, and you might find a new passion. As for beginner tips, I just mentioned two, I guess, which is camera movement, and I guess I'll clarify camera movement by saying camera stabilization is a big one, and so is audio. So camera stabilization is important because everyone, I think, understands that shaky cam footage is just difficult to watch, and it really doesn't matter what the subject is. If the footage is too shaky, it's like viewers will just get disoriented or motion sick just watching it. So you got to figure out how to keep the camera stable. So many cameras now have in-body stabilization built in that it's not as big a deal, but a lot of the same fundamentals of how to keep your camera still for photography work for video as well. So one of them is 3 points of contact, right? So you want to like keep your elbows in, one elbow, two elbows, and then like pull the camera itself close to your face. And if you can make contact with the camera on your face, then that's the 3rd point. Kind of difficult sometimes with modern cameras, but you can actually get like little accessories that are like eyepieces that stick out.
Yeah.
But 3 points of contact help keep things extra stable. Obviously, tripods work great for video as well as photography. Although I would say that if you're using a inexpensive photo tripod and you want to shoot video with it, try not to move the camera too much. The heads of those tripods don't they're not built for nice smooth pans and tilts. Also, you can get stabilizers pretty inexpensively that will use a brushless motor to keep things smooth. But otherwise, look for ways to keep the camera as still as possible and turn that image stabilization on. And the second is audio capture, which if there's anything more frustrating than shaky camera, it's what's the word? Inaudible audio.
Inaudible, yes.
Yeah, so you can't understand what people are saying, or you're doing that thing where when you're watching it, you got to ride the remote control.
Oh, that's the worst.
When
Yeah.
someone talks, it's like blasting. You turn it down. That can be tricky. We always say, don't use the microphone that's built into your camera. Try to get an external mic if you can. But if you have to use the mic that's inside the camera, like you just don't want to make the investment of a microphone, keep the camera really close to your subject. So don't shoot across the room at someone who's talking to the camera. You really have to be close. Those microphones are not that good. They're not that directional. So get the microphone close. And actually, that advice applies to any microphone. The closer you can get the microphone, generally, the better sound quality you can get. But if you can focus on those things, keep the camera stable, make sure the microphone is close, and you're capturing a nice crisp sound, that'll get you a long way. Another thing to do is to plug your headphones into the camera itself. So not all new cameras or entry-level cameras have a headphone jack, but if they do, you can plug like your earbuds into that, and that'll help you monitor the sound. You can't trust it entirely because what you hear in your earbuds are not necessarily what's going to come out of speakers, but you'll listen for things like crackly audio or wind noise. Everyone has this experience, I think, shooting on their phone or a simple camera where they're capturing some event and then they take it home and they look at it. I guess you can watch it on your phone now, but you get this like rumbling audio of the wind hitting the microphone. You got to keep your earbuds in so you can hear for that and make adjustments as you go. But that's really the big ones. Assuming you already know the fundamentals of photography and exposure and focus and all that, stabilization and audio.
Now, let's say that, first of all, I guess before we go any further, I'd love to get your thoughts on that movie. It came out a few years ago, Hardcore Henry. Do you remember that movie? It was like
Henry.
You said you've never heard of it?
Oh.
It was like first person view. It even had like theatrical release, and it was so hard to watch because being first person view, it's very shaky. It's very shaky, and I ended up having to leave the theater. Like I paid $20 or whatever to see this movie, and I left because it was so shaky and it was unnerving to watch. So I love that tip. That's a great tip. Try to keep things as steady as possible, and then just simple camera movements and bump up the quality of the audio. That's great stuff. So now that we have, let's say, let me ask you, do you think that there's a world in which photography and video exist together, or are they pretty mutually exclusive?
Well, I mean, from a skills perspective, there's certainly tons of overlap. And now you're seeing all kinds of filmmakers who are venturing into photography and vice versa. So that's going to continue, I'm sure. As for creative work, yeah, absolutely, there's going to merge over. So I can think of two examples where the two have sort of crossed paths or maybe have merged. So one of them is motion graphics. So you may have seen, well, actually anyone who's ever watched like old Ken Burns documentaries know that Ken Burns can tell an 8-hour story with stills, right?
Yes.
Stills and audio, obviously, narration. So that's actually one of the first skills that, if you ever want to get into documentary or video work generally, is to learn how to tell stories with video using only photos, using basically pan and scan over images. But even in motion graphics, there's a lot going on with there's this effect that's really popular. It's been popular for 15 years or so now, where you can go into your software and like cut out the subject of a photograph and separate them from the background and then do this like 3D parallax look.
Oh yes.
So there's a lot you can do with photographs in video, and you can tell entire stories without recording any motion pictures. Outside of that, one thing that I really enjoy, what is the name of these things? Cinemagraph?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Where you take the image and you can. I had the creator of one of the more popular Cinemagraph apps on the podcast, and yeah, so you can like have a picture, you put in some key points, and then like make them stretch or so. Like, is stretch the right word? And then it just kind of loops.
I think it's any motion element. So like a cinemagraph, from my understanding, I should probably Google this to make sure I'm using the right word, but is this idea that it's a photograph with an animated looping element, right? So
yes.
An example might be someone standing in the rain and the rain is pouring, but it's otherwise a photograph, right? Or someone sitting next to the fire and the fire is flicking, but it's otherwise a photograph. I saw one where it was like an Olympic, torchbearer, and they're like frozen in frame, running, but the flame of the torch is burning. I think those are really interesting. I don't know how mainstream they'll ever be until we get to like, the Harry Potter world where, animated pictures hanging on the wall and all that. But I think those are two examples that I can think of where these two disciplines have sort of crossed paths.
So then that brings me kind of to my next question here, which is talking about, you don't know how mainstream cinemagraphs are going to go, because it's kind of a strange medium to be able to view, right? It almost seems kind of gimmicky, right? You look at it and you're like, oh, that's interesting, and then you just keep going. Whereas video has the ability to stop you, and you'll want to watch the story from beginning to end. And with a photo, it can also stop you and make you really look and kind of dive deeper into an image. Um, where do you think that it's possible that we live in a world where both of those things can be combined and still allow us to view them together? I mean, again, bad question there, not fully formed, but obviously, so that's going to be a video, right? I just answered my own question there. Kind of like that Ken Burns uh, 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 example that you gave there. We're taking photos and then we're turning them into video. But in the world of storytelling, do you think that there's a situation in which we use video and we have photos, but together they just make a stronger story?
You know what might be a good example of this, and it's not like, you know, the sexiest thing in the world. Well, maybe to some people it is social media, right? Where people do tell stories on Instagram using a combination of images and video. So just like as you're flipping through, you know, a post that has a number, what do they call it? A carousel, you know, where you're looking at photos and blended within them is video clips, where if you look at anything individually, maybe the story isn't there, but it's sort of a combination of these things. It sort of paints a broader picture. And again, this is a consumer level thing, you know, whether this translates to Hollywood, I'm not sure. But that's one example I can think of where it's like this sort of multimedia thing. But, you know, to your point about the Ken Burns is it video? I mean, does taking these images and then doing pans over the top of them and adding voiceover narration and music, does that mean it's no longer a photograph, or is it video now? You know, I think you could say it's kind of both. And, you know, I think that eventually, yeah, back to the Cinemagraph idea, you know, this idea that, you know, video will capture someone's attention maybe in a way that a photo won't, at least like in terms of like a fleeting passerby. You know, that happens because our eyes are attracted to motion. It's probably like dates back to our time on the savannah, you know, looking for lions or something, that we just like snap our eyes to motion. That's why video is so attention grabbing. But I can definitely foresee, you know, more examples in, you know, the outside world, outside of our screens on our phones and our laptops and our TVs, where screens are kind of everywhere. You know, actually, we're seeing this now with a lot of billboards. They're like electronic billboards, where just a little bit of motion in an otherwise static image, like a billboard, will capture someone's attention in a way that just a classic still photograph wouldn't. So I do think that we are going to see that, especially as, you know, display technology progresses and prices come down. If we have displays everywhere, electronic displays, we're definitely going to see way more motion than we ever have before.
Yeah. So a few months ago, I talked to a photographer, and his name is Simon. And what he did was he decided to learn photography while documenting his journey, essentially, right? So he did a one photo a week project, and it was only supposed to be for a year, but now I think he's going on year 7, which is awesome for him. But what he did was to extend the learning, I suppose, or the education side of it. He is now taking those photos, and then he puts it in, you know, Premiere or iMovie, and then narrates kind of how he got that shot, right, and kind of how that photo came about. And I always struggle with this idea of like, yes, like we're looking at this photo and it's cool to be able to hear that story, and that's a whole element right there, right? But there's also something to be said about viewing a photograph like in print, because print is kind of that natural medium for a photograph, and then just letting yourself kind of figure out what's going on in an image. What are your thoughts on kind of the differences between the two, and kind of where new photographers who are getting into photography but also interested in video, what are your thoughts on kind of how they can explore those two things?
Well, I think the example that you gave of the guy who's trying to do both simultaneously is a good one. And it's interesting because a lot of the fundamentals are the same for both, and yet the process of learning to become a great photographer versus becoming a great filmmaker are quite a bit different. And you do have to focus on different things. You know, in a photograph, you have one frame. That's all you get to tell an interesting story. And so you got to pour a lot of attention, a lot of effort into making sure everything is just right in this one frame. Although, you know, I don't want to discount, you know, the sort of, what do they call it? Street photography, guerrilla photography style. But with filmmaking, you know, you're working on different things. You know, the person who is documenting their photography journey is probably not treating every video shot with the same level of care that they are with their photographs. Likewise, they're probably not giving the script for the video that they're creating as much care as they are for their photograph. And those are important disciplines that if you want to become a master in either craft, you're going to be you know, focusing your attention in different directions. That said, you know, as you're developing your skills, certainly you can working on the camera and the composition and the lighting, and those skills will transfer over pretty well. Like this person who was working on their photo skills surely became a better video shooter or cinematographer in the process. Now, if they want to make a movie every week, they're going to need to learn different skills, you know, because capturing a beautiful image, even if that image tells a little bit of a story, you know, isn't quite developing all the skills that you need to become a great filmmaker. You know, you really do have to focus a lot on editing and writing in ways that you wouldn't have to do that with photography.
You know what I always found interesting is that, and I never thought about this in, say, high school, but, you know, when DVDs were first, this sounds so old, when DVDs were really, like, gaining popularity and they were, like, putting new features into DVDs, and they would always make, you know, a deleted scenes portion. And I was always so excited to watch those deleted scenes because I was like, you know, what didn't they put in the movie? But it wasn't until I went to film school that I realized somebody had to write that. Like, somebody had to write that scene, somebody had to plan it, and when somebody wrote that scene, they wrote that scene with the hopes that that scene was going to push the movie forward in some sense, right? That it was going to push that story that was being told forward, and yet here it is, completely removed from the movie, because it didn't do anything. So let's talk a little bit about what you were talking about earlier, which is just the simple 3-act structure, right? For those just getting into video work, you know, what is it, and what would it look like to capture?
So, yeah, so, I mean, just the general idea of the scene that gets cut, I think is a process that happens when, kind of like when you're doing any kind of creative work, is you have an idea of something that's going to work out. And as you're working through it, you realize, actually, you know, this thing that I thought was going to work really doesn't work. And that happens all the time. I don't care if you're, you know, making a movie or, you know, you're making a business card, right? That process happens. The 3-act structure is just like this. It's basically it's the beginning, middle, and end of any story. And this is the idea here transcends just filmmaking. It's the same thing for, you know, if you're writing a novel, you're probably following this. But it's basically if you take the 3-act structure, beginning, middle, end, and go one level deeper, it's this concept called Freytag's pyramid, which I don't know the history of the guy Freytag, but he basically documented this idea that stories happen in these phases. So the phases, just to go through them quickly, is exposition, where you're just sort of setting the scene. You're introducing all the characters. There's an inciting incident where conflict, you know, is introduced. There's rising in action. So in this story, the tension is climbing. And this happens usually in Act 2 of the 3-act structure. There's the climax. So this is like, you know, in the scene from the 1989 Batman when the Joker falls off the building. That's the climax, right?
Yeah.
There's the falling action when now tension declines. And there's resolution or denouement when the story sort of wraps up. And this general idea, the 3-act structure, Freytag's pyramid, can be applied to any story that's told over time, I believe. And again, I'm not enough of a photography expert to say, does this, you know, if this works with photography? Like you said, maybe in a series of photographs, it would work quite well. But when you're telling any story in time, whether it's video, you're making a movie, whether you are making a commercial, whether you're making a bunch of TikToks, theoretically, to tell a good story, this general Freytag's pyramid, the 3-act structure, helps to capture attention and hold it in a way that is just I don't know why, it's human psychology or something, but it just works in order to get people to understand what's happening and be interested and are have some emotional investment in the story. Happens in novels, you name it. There are other storytelling formats. There are certainly films that don't necessarily follow this format, but this is kind of the bedrock foundation of storytelling.
Let's go back to that zoo example real quick, all right? Because when I go to the zoo and I hear from many new photographers, they want to capture everything. They're going to shoot every little detail. We're gonna get the ketchup on the face when he's eating the chicken nuggets or whatever. The little kid at the lunch. Like, we're going to capture all these photos. When it comes to that 3-act structure idea, is this something that we should be planning before? And then know, like, you know what, I don't really need to capture lunch here? Or is this something that we just capture it all and then edit down after the fact?
I would say that if you're taking photographs at the zoo, you can kind of think about yourself in like a documentarian, right? So one of the big challenges that documentary filmmakers have is there's something going on, and they have to explore it and investigate it, and the story unfolds as it's happening. So they find the story in the process of making the story. And so obviously you don't want to like plot out the conflict of your trip to the zoo, right? You want there to be conflict to make a good story. Like, if you're going to show pictures to your family afterwards and there's going to be 20 photos, you want there to be some sort of conflict, because as people go through these series, they're seeing like what happened and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe blank happened. That's the conflict. But at the same time, you don't want to like be plotting and scheming and being like, I'm going to make sure that, Billy drops his ice cream cone on the ground or something. Right?
I'm going to knock it out of his hand.
But as you're taking photos, you take a lot of photos. And again, this is a little bit outside of my domain, but I would say you're looking for the story and you're looking for elements of conflict. And as you afterwards are piecing these photos together and you're choosing them in a way that, you hope that when you show your friends and family this collection of images, that it doesn't fall into that same sort of hit that so many family photos have, where it's like you're excited because you were there and it brings back memories, but no one really else is excited to look at the photo.
Yes.
You can go along and show these, and maybe with captions or something, you're sort of telling the story of what happened, and you put the most exciting things, kind of like in the last third. And you have this rising tension, this rising conflict as you go. And that's what's going to keep people like, oh man, I can't wait to see what the next photo holds. And again, sorry, this is kind of out of my domain. I don't know if people actually do this in photography, but if I was trying to make tell a story with photos about a trip to the zoo, that's what I would do. I'd take a bunch of photos and look for those moments of tension and conflict and try to tell a story with that. And, I say tension and conflict, which are kind of negative sounding words. They don't have to be traumatic, but just sort of points of interest is what you're looking for. They could be perfectly innocent, like Billy dropping his ice cream cone is not a big deal. But if you got the photo, that'd be a great shot. Sorry to say.
But if I knocked it out of his hand, that would be traumatic, and that would be conflict. Yeah.
Yeah. So you would be a bad person, but the photo might be.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said that, because I think, when it comes to photos, displaying the photos is always the challenge. I think when it comes to shooting video, the barrier, for me at least, is the editing. But then once you have it, it's fun and it's easy to share, and like, it just goes out there. It's one video, right? Whether it's a minute, 5 minutes, whatever it is, here it is. But when it comes to photos, I don't want to inundate everybody on my Facebook feed or whatever with 100 photos that I took at the zoo and me knocking Charlie's ice cream out of his hand. I don't want to do that. So that's always a hard thing for me, and trying to figure out other ways to display those. Sometimes I use, I don't know if you've heard of it, Animoto. So it's just like a slideshow app, right? You load in a bunch of photos, creates a video slideshow. You can set it to music if you want to, and then now you have a collection of images that can be shared much easier. And that's one of my favorite things to do. So if anybody's listening, like, that's a great way to do it. But aside from that, I think you've really helped me there, kind of uncovered this hidden block for me, which is how am I trying to share my photos? How am I trying to get a point across and tell this larger story of essentially what we're doing is we're just capturing our lives, right, as photographers.
Yeah.
Maybe it's
Yeah,
a little bit different for video, but for photography, we're just capturing our lives. So I know that we're coming to the end of our time. Do you have any last maybe ideas or on how to do a long-term project like like our entire lives?
Boy, how do
Yeah,
you
two
do
or
a
three
long-term
sentences
project?
max, by the way. Yeah.
I always think the most interesting thing when someone does one of these big projects um, is to see how they develop their own personal style. Like if you were doing a photo project for 5 years or your entire life, good luck telling one coherent story over that entire time. Although actually afterwards, if you're coming towards the end of your life and you have a lifetime of photographs, you could edit these together into a book that would probably tell a pretty compelling story that follows a nice Freytag's pyramid structure. But
Yeah.
aside from that, I always think the most important or most interesting thing is to see how someone's personal style evolves. And it happens with everyone who takes enough photos or shoots enough video where, they start out and they're emulating someone else's look or someone else's style. And eventually that you just like, they run dry. You're taking so many images, you just can't emulate someone else's look forever. And, and I think this is true no matter what you're doing, whether you're taking photographs or, baking cookies, right? Like if you do it enough, you start to get into your own groove and you sort of find what you're good at, you find what works, you expand on that. And as a viewer of photographs and a viewer of collections, I love seeing how people's style develops and seeing that evolution of these like kind of generic looking photos or, photos that are emulating something else into something that's truly unique. And so, as a creator, I would look for those opportunities, look for opportunities to play and experiment, to create something new, to create something that is uniquely yours. Even if it doesn't come through in a singular photograph, but as you're piecing together this collection over many years, you start to see, oh, actually, I do have this signature look or this signature style that, when you look at it as a whole, says a lot about me as a photographer or as a creator. I think again that's just really interesting to look at. The actual content of the photos is always nice, but when I'm looking at a lifetime of collections, those are the things that are most interesting to me.
Mike, I don't know how to end it any better than that. That was inspirational. That was educational right there. And I think that the listeners are going to get a lot out of that little sentiment right there. So thank you very much. Now, I know that we're at the end of our time here, but before I let you go, can you let the listeners know where they can follow you online and learn more about video makers?
So if you're listening to this podcast, I guess that must mean you're a podcast listener. So I encourage you to check out our relatively new podcast, the Videomaker podcast. It's Videomaker is a publication, a media company for beginners and enthusiasts. So if you're at all interested in video production, I encourage you to check that out. Or you can go to videomaker.com and read articles and watch videos and that kind of stuff. But yeah, those are the things.
What about you? Can we follow you on Instagram? Can we follow you? Where can we find you online?
You can if you want. I'm not much of a social media person. I'm like one of those people that I don't trust Silicon Valley, but I do have profiles there. You could check me out, MN Wilhelm, on I think that's the handle on Instagram and Twitter, and that's all I use.
Okay, right on. Well, I'll link to it in the show notes. You didn't do a very good job of selling it right there, but we'll see what we can do. Anyway, again,
you can follow at Videomaker on both of those places, where we are quite active.
There you go. Perfect. Much better than the personal one right there. Well, Mike, thank you again so much for coming on and sharing everything that you did. I look forward to keeping up with you in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
I really hope that you enjoyed that interview with Mike today and picked up some tips if you're looking to start taking some videos. And if not, I hope that you picked up a thing or two on how to tell a better story with your images. Mike is, very knowledgeable and shared a ton of great information. And if you like this chat with Mike and you want to learn more about video, again, check out his podcast, Videomaker Podcast. And you can listen to that right here, where you are listening to this podcast right now. That is it for this week. I, again, hope that you enjoyed, hope that you learned something, hope that you took something away from this one that you're going to implement into your photos, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.